Добрий вечір, шановна громада. Я називаюся Таras Shevchenko. Я є головою наукового товариства імені Шевченка в Канаді і маю велику приємність вітати вас сьогодні на нашій черговій доповіді НТСh. З особливою приємністю я хочу привітати нашу дорогу і дуже шановну гостю, професорку англійської літератури Полтавського університету Ірину Макаryk, яка спеціально сьогодні приїхала до нас в Полтаву, щоб виступити із своєю доповіддю. Перед тим, як ми почнемо доповідь, я, як завжди, хочу подякувати нашим спонсорам, в першу чергу фундації «Будучність», завдяки якій ми маємо можливість проводити наші доповіді і конференції в затишних залах ООН. Хочу так само подякувати Українському Конгресу українців Канади, нашим медійним спонсорам, телепрограмам «Контакт», «Форум ТВ», радіопрограмам «Пісня з України» і «Поступ». Всім щиро дякуємо. Також хочу подякувати нашим гостям із University of Toronto Press, які сьогодні тут загостили із дуже важливої нагоди. Буквально місяць-півтора тому в тому видавництві вийшла в світ книжка, остання книжка професор Makaryk «Shakespeare in Ukraine». І сьогодні представники із університету, Торонтойського університету прес, цього видавництва принесли книжки, які ви будете мати можливість тут придбати. Професор Makaryk без гонорару із продажу книжок дарує Шекспірівському центрові в Запоріжжі в Україні. Так що, купуючи її книжку, ви не лише маєте нагоду збагатитися новими знаннями і поповнити свою приватну бібліотеку, але тим самим ви підтримуєте центр шекспірознавства в Україні, який в Запоріжжі, просто дуже близько до лінії фронту, продовжує працювати і діяти. Зараз ми вже приступаємо до нашої доповіді і до представлення нашої шановної доповідачки, професора Ірини Макаryk. Я попрошу професора Торонтойського університету Тараса Шевченка. Просимо до слова.
We have a, sorry, would you like to say a word now? Okay. We have a representative from University of Toronto Press, Taras Shevchenko, who will say a few words before me, and then we'll switch gears.
Just delighted to be here at the conference for Professor Makaryk's book, which is, I mean, it is not the culmination because there is more work to come, but the continuation of what is now almost a 40-year-long collaboration over the course of 8 books, many of them on Shakespeare, but not exclusively so. So I had the pleasure to work with her on this book and on the tail end of her last book. And always a pleasure. And delighted that we're able to bring this important work on Shakespeare in Ukraine to come bring articles together from across Professor Makaryk's career in one place and shows the depth and breadth of the connection between Shakespeare and Ukraine. Thank you.
It's my pleasure and honor to present today's speaker, Professor Professor Irena Makaryk. Professor Irena Makaryk earned her bachelor degree, her master's degree, and doctorate from the University of Toronto. So she's quite familiar with the academic setting, with the cultural setting in the city. She commenced her teaching in the University of Ottawa, where she taught for decades, earned the distinguished professor title, and for many years she was the vice dean of the Faculty of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies. Her research focuses on theatrical modernism in Europe, Shakespeare, and the translations and stagings of his plays in Ukraine and Central Europe, on modernism in literature and art, and the arts in times of war. She's an author of 9 books in Shakespeare studies, literary theory, history of theater, and modernism, and over 100 scholarly publications. She's one of the driving forces in the creation of the chair of Ukrainian studies at the University of Ottawa. Over the years, she organized a series of international scholarly conferences under the rubric Toward in Ukraine. A key direction of her work is an effort in decolonizing the perceptions of Ukraine and Ukrainian culture in the academic and larger public spheres in Canada and North America. Since the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Professor Makaryk dedicated her energies to helping Ukrainian volunteer organizations, participating in numerous media platforms with podcasts and lectures as a cultural diplomat for Ukraine. I'll briefly outline some of her books. There's no time to dwell in every of her extensive and remarkable scholarly career. One of the earlier publications that she put out is about The Harrowing of Hell, a 17th century Ukrainian play in its European context. The book, this slim book, contains a translation of this remarkable Baroque, very original Baroque Ukrainian play, a mystery play, and a study of its context and content, so it remains valuable for anyone who is interested in Ukrainian literature, early modern culture. But the larger portion of Professor Makaryk's scholarship, of course, is dedicated to Shakespeare and his transformations in modern translations, stagings in Ukraine. Shakespeare in The Undiscovered Born is the first book-length study in English of Leskovas's modernist, often scandalous productions of Shakespeare in early Soviet Ukraine, during the short-lived period we know today as executed Renaissance, in this book, she drew on a vast number of published and unpublished memoirs, journals, letters, newspapers, posters, manifestos. And in this monograph, this pioneer monograph, Professor Makaryk analyzes the creative legacy of Leskovas and re-examines larger concepts and issues such as classics and canon, high versus low culture, ideology and populism, authorship, and the dichotomies between the imperial and colonial, the periphery and the center. This book was translated not long ago into Ukrainian under the title «Перетворення Шекспіра. Leskovas. Український модернізм. Радянська культурна політика 1920-х років». Professor Makaryk edited several volumes of comparative and interdisciplinary Shakespeare scholarship, including Shakespeare and the Second World War, Memory, Culture, Identity, Shakespeare in the Worlds of Communism and Socialism, Shakespeare and Canada, Remembrance of Ourselves, and Shakespeare in Canada, A World Elsewhere, with question mark. Among other remarkable publications that Professor Makaryk organized and published is Modernism in Kiev, Jubilant Experimentation. It's a volume to which I had an honor to contribute. It's a remarkable panorama of Kiev in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, that includes visual arts, theater, literature, and ideology. Her more recent monograph focuses on Paris 1925 Expo, and it's called April in Paris, Theatricality, Modernism, and Politics at the 1925 Art Deco Exposition. And last but not least, this year, for her contribution to scholarship and to, generally speaking, academic and cultural life in Canada, Professor Makaryk was elected to the Royal Society of Canada. So much
Дякую, такий гарний вступ. Хочу теж подякувати з академії НТШ за цю нагоду поділитися своїми дослідами і своєю пасією Шекспіром і Україною. Як моя дуже добре знайома Оля Петровська сказала, Ірина, на одній планеті ті дві твої улюблені теми Шекспір і Україна. Так що дякую, Оля. Гарно бачити різних знайомих і бути в Торонті, де ми тоді сподівали нарочно. Сьогодні я буду здебільшого говорити по-англійськи. Книжка написана по-англійськи, будуть деякі цитати по-українськи. І очевидно, що я вже не маю наприкінці запити по-українськи або по-англійськи, як вам зручно. Мені здається також, що треба говорити тепер по-англійськи, тому що це є особливий історичний момент. І треба нам знайти міжнародні платформи, на які ми можемо говорити, дискутувати і поінформувати світ про Україну. Кожний в свій спосіб має цю місію, цей обов'язок, щоб підтвердити, що українська культура є багатогранна, цікава, глибока. І ця книжка доказує, що Шекспір належить до української культури. Він є частиною нашої спадщини. Отже, я почну перше з деякими хитами. So this paper is essentially in English with some Ukrainian quotations that have to be said in Ukrainian, and of course a translation will follow. So the title of this paper is From Shevchenko to Zelenskyy. So this gives you an idea of time frame, right, from the 19th century to the present. And I begin with a series of questions. How best to reflect a nation's values, desires, and ambitions in circumstances of censorship, oppression, prohibition, or, most radically, during the upheaval and barbarism of the war. How to convey the struggle against erasure of history, culture, and identity. And ultimately, how to convey this to the rest of the world. One strategy is to look outward to seek international platforms. And for nearly 200 years, Ukrainian poets, writers, scholars, dramatists, theater, and visual artists have communicated with the global community through the medium of Shakespeare, the most translated and the most performed playwright in the world. As more than a classic, a hyper-canonical figure, Shakespeare inhabits a contact zone where many cultures can meet and where dialogue can take place. For Ukrainians, Shakespeare has at various times served as mirror, prism, and megaphone, amplifying and broadcasting their values, hopes, and concerns. Such a long and deep engagement with Shakespeare confirms historian Serhiy Blokh's contention that Shakespeare's claim to independence has always had a European orientation. This is a major theme of my book. First, a brief word about the book cover. Hopefully this works. Good. The image shown comes from a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Kyiv Molodey Theatre, directed by Andrei Milonis and starring Daria Hracheva as Titania. Here we see Titania's gesture of Jacques, horror and shock. That comes when Puck's magic juice wears off, and she faces the awful recognition that she has been besotted with the beast. Fortuitously, for the purposes of Michael, this arresting image also seems to show Titania creating a kind of megaphone with her hands, as if to reproduce the anguish and the terror of Ukrainians living through the war today. The connection between this play and today's war is not as far-fetched as one would imagine. War lurks everywhere in Shakespeare's works, not just in the history plays or in the tragedies, but even around the edges of the comedies, including in A Midsummer Night's Dream. We begin with a recent pivotal moment. Just days after Russia's sudden invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy solemnly addressed the British Parliament, invoking Hamlet's famous question, to be or not to be. Zelenskyy emphatically asserted Ukraine's answer to that existential question. It was to be. No allusion could be briefer or more easily understood. As one of the most translated phrases in literature, these two simple words nonetheless carry complex depths of meaning. The gravity of the threat to Ukraine's existence and the equally firm determination to defend Ukraine's sovereignty in the face of unprovoked aggression. In effect, this concise allusion acted as a metaphorical megaphone, asserting Ukraine's message of the right and the firm intent to exist. As importantly, it affirmed Ukraine's identification with Western cultural markers and values. Thus, Hamlet's to be linked Ukraine to Britain, and beyond that, to an international community of like-minded citizens and entities around the globe who instantly understood that message. The second Shakespearean moment occurred only days after the war began. In Ivano-Frankivsk on the 7th of March 2022, citizens huddled together for a performance of the neo-Gothic neo-opera Hamlet in the basement of the Ivan Franko National Academic Music and Drama Theatre. Directed by Rostislav Derzhatilsky, the quickly arranged performance, a revival, was performed while taking on a new function, that of sheltering its audience from airstrikes. Notably, Derzhatilsky deliberately chose not to stage a reassuring and amusing entertainment for his anxious spectators, nor did he choose a propagandistic play, but instead a work about a deeply ethical prince surrounded by corruption and betrayal. A man who thinks. One gesture changed in this reprise of the production. The Danish prince, played by Oleksiy Nakovsky, came on stage draped in the Ukrainian flag, a poignant rallying gesture visually signaling the existence of Ukraine, its bonds with the Universal Guard and with the West. The director and the actors publicly dedicated their production to the people of the United Kingdom for unhesitatingly supporting Ukraine and in recognition of what British civilians themselves had endured during the blitz of the Second World War. A distillation of memory, identity, and trauma, Hamlet thus simultaneously served as a wellspring of human connection, unity, and empathy. As we shall see, the 2022 production was not the first use of Shakespeare in a wartime context in Ukraine, nor was it the first instance of employing Shakespeare to assert its values, identity, and cultural sovereignty. The transhistorical and transgeographical connections encapsulated by these two moments at the very start of Russia's war in Ukraine potently reveals Shakespeare's significance to Ukraine's cultural history. But if Shakespeare is as embedded in Ukrainian culture as I claim, how is it that the first Shakespeare stage production did not take place until 1920? To answer that question, we need to look briefly at the 19th century. Zaburonek Ploy, Forbidden Works. In part, Shakespeare's importance lies in the fact that access to his works was long forbidden. Although Ukrainians first encountered Shakespeare in the late 18th century, they were only permitted to read or to see his works in a foreign language. While audiences could enjoy Shakespeare in Russian in Eastern Ukraine, under the Russian Empire, or in German or Polish in Western Ukraine, under Austro-Hungary, they were prevented from doing so in their own language. Censorship was most stringent in the East. At the height of the prohibitions during the reign of Alexander II, a secretly distributed circular written by Pyotr Valuyev, Minister of the Interior, infamously declared that, quote, no separate Little Russian language ever existed, does exist, or could exist. Because by Little Russian means Ukrainian. A little over a decade later, in 1876, Anne's ukaz, signed by the Tsar, banned the importation and publication of all books in and translations into Ukrainian, including the Bible and Shakespeare. In 1881, the teaching of the Ukrainian language in public schools and its use in church sermons was prohibited. All theater performances were banned. Librarians were instructed to remove all Ukrainian books in print from their shelves. Even Ukrainian folk songs, when publicly performed, had to be sung in Russian or in another foreign language, including in French. Some restrictions were lifted near the end of the 19th century, others were never officially rescinded. These included limitations on subject matter and genre. Domestic and foreign themes only, but no satire, no history, no romantic verse plays, or plays of urban life. Upper and middle class characters were required to speak Russian, peasants and children on stage Ukrainian. So we have stereotypes that are being formed at that time. Chillingly, on the 3rd of April 2022, Valuyev's 19th century assertions found new expression at the start of the current war, when the Russian information agency Novosti published Timofey Sergeyev's article, What Russia Should Do to Ukraine. Sergeyev called for a complete erasure of Ukrainian identity. Even the word Ukrainian, he wrote, cannot be allowed to exist. The war is justified, he insisted, because the re-education of Ukrainians is not possible. Authorization to play Shakespeare never came from the Tsars. Ukrainian Shakespeare could only be performed privately, at the home of trusted friends. Such an amateur production of excerpts from Hamlet occurred in 1882 at the home of Mikhail Staditsky, who translated, directed, and starred in the lead role. And you can see Staditsky on the right, and on the left, Mykola Lysenko, the subject of many of Dr. Maraturchin's papers and works. And he did the music for this production, very private amateur production of Hamlet for the very first time. Even after the 1905 revolution, imperial censors refused permission to stage Hamlet because, they argued, a Ukrainian production might evoke laughter in its presumption to treat a world classic in a peasant language. By the way, those things have not changed. I've been to Shakespeare conferences where Russian colleagues ask me what I'm working on, and when I say it's Ukrainian Shakespeare, really? That sounds so funny. So it's not gone. It's not just a 19th century phenomenon. Despite these prohibitions, 19th century Ukrainian writers and translators intensely engaged with Shakespeare. It is notable that Ukraine's great literary trinity, Taras Shevchenko, Ivana Franko, Lesya Ukrainka, all responded to the force of Shakespeare's works. For Shevchenko, Shakespeare represented the gold standard of literary creativity. So, for example, he shouted out, "Shakespeare, Shakespeare," in enthusiastic response to a public reading of Markovitch's short stories. He was especially moved by King Lear, and in 1843 created an aquatent of the once powerful tyrannical figure, now reduced to a vulnerable old man struggling through a literal and spiritual storm, accompanied only by his doppelganger, the fool. As Ukrainian audiences would know, Shevchenko was later arrested without trial, exiled to the far reaches of the Russian Empire, given a lifetime sentence as a private soldier, and on the specific orders of the Tsar, forbidden from painting and writing. When he was finally given limited reading privileges, he requested 2 books, the Bible and Shakespeare. Both represented spiritual sustenance, longing for truth, freedom, beauty, justice. With the passing of the Tsar, and after nearly 10 years of exile, Shevchenko was permitted to return to Russia, but not to Ukraine. In St. Petersburg, he encountered the magnificent Afro-American actor, Ira Aldrich, with whom he became good friends, and whose roles included Othello, Shylock, and King Lear. And Lear, by the way, he played in whiteface, which is quite interesting. I don't know of many examples of an actor who does that. Enthralled, Shevchenko, who would go on to all of Aldrich's performances, wrote to another actor, the Ukrainian Mikhail Shakespeare, that Aldrich performs wonders on the stage and shows us a living Shakespeare. Sounds like the theatricality there in the background too. Touring extensively, Aldrich ignited a passion for Shakespeare, including in Ukraine, where the struggle for permission to create a Ukrainian theater continued. The young Ivan Kubilevich, stage name Irena Makaryk, determinedly walked 60 kilometers in one day to catch a performance of Ira Aldrich and then walked home the next day. He was inspired so much by his performance and his personal history that Kubilevich himself became an actor, playwright, and a founding member of theatrical, theater of Korypheye, that is the theater of star actors. And this is just a very quick overview of some of the key moments in which writers, poets, and bourgeois have connected with Shakespeare in the 19th century. There's too much to bring to the table today. But very quickly, translating Shakespeare. If Shakespeare was not staged in Ukrainian lands in the 19th century, he was nonetheless an important literary presence, as I've suggested. Poet and dramatist Lesya Ukrainka frequently alluded to the works of Shakespeare, especially Hamlet, which became a kind of touchstone by which to scrutinize her poetic calling, a calling often at odds with direct political activity and in conflict with expected gender roles. For writer William Shakespeare, who translated 13 Shakespeare plays, Shakespeare was the Homer of the New World. And in his poem about his poetic calling, до Шекспіра, Шекспір батько наш, усім народам рівний, світло творчества, промінь нового світу. So this Homer of the New World, this writer who belongs to all kinds of nations. Another luminary, poet, writer, and the first to translate some of the sonnets, Ivana Franko, also crafted the introductions, scholarly introductions to Kurish's translations. And he also translated the Merchant of Venice. As a literary editor in Western Ukraine, Franko also maintained close contact with Taras Shevchenko, the very first professional Shakespearean scholar in the Russian Empire, and an elected member of the new Shakespeare Society of Britain. It could in fact be argued that Russian Shakespeare scholarship began with this Ukrainian, who in 1872 became the first chairholder of the newly formed Faculty of World Literature at the Moscow University, and yet whose scholarship could only be published in Russian. So Ukraine cut out of world literature. Just as today, so in the first decades of the 20th century, creativity was unleashed in the midst of upheaval. Then it was World War, revolutions, civil war, anarchy, and many, many changes of government, with a very short period of independence. At last, artists could have direct, unmediated access to the texts, genres, and subjects which hitherto had been prohibited. But the burning question was how to escape provincialism without falling into the trap of neo-colonialism of another sort. Very much aware of the snare, writers such as novelist and polemicist Mykola Hryderovy explained that Ukraine's preferred orientation was to the west, not to the north and east. But as he also insisted, to reject the models of Russia for those of Europe was not with the goal of yoking our art to some other wagon, bringing up the rear, but with the aim of reviving it after the asphyxiating atmosphere of backwardness. This is a really important point. This consciousness of new connections, new contexts, would create a fresh identity and not replace one cultural colonialism or imperialism with yet another. It was going to open up Ukraine culture to world culture. And Shakespeare was one of those figures that was taken out. Sharing Hryderovy's view was the supremely talented and charismatic Les Kurwas, another of my passions, as Professor Zelenskyy has noted. Kurwas as actor, director, playwright, translator, pedagogue, theorist, filmmaker, and musician was finally able to create the very first stage production of Shakespeare in Ukraine, not Hamlet, but Macbeth, a play prohibited in the Tsar's period, mostly because of the murder of the king, but eminently suited to the early 20th century world of political assassination, violence, and cruelty. Knowledgeable in the traditions and conventions of world theater, having studied both in Vienna and in Lviv, Kurwas spearheaded a theatrical movement away from Russia, which he called the Dead Center. He aimed to create not just a great Ukrainian theater, but a magnificent theater that would astonish the world. This ambitious goal was to be approached through a necessary first step: performance and analysis of the great classics, including Shakespeare. Macbeth was only one of his many proposed Shakespeare projects. Indeed, beginning in his student years, Kurwas had the ambition to stage the whole Shakespearean canon, all 37 plays. That was his intent. In 1918, he started his first steps in that direction with his Molodei theater, young theater. He began preparing Romeo and Juliet. You can see here the cast list. The parts of the cast, they were learning their parts, and they were also learning Twelfth Night. For the following season, from 1919, he had already announced A Midsummer Night's Dream and Macbeth. But all these plans collapsed when Denikin's army entered Kiev and completely ransacked the theater. Food distribution networks were shattered. Some actors failed to attend rehearsals because they had to go begging for food. With a curtailed theatrical company, Kitarante, Kurwas left for the countryside, where he began preparing Macbeth. Lyubov Hakebush, his lady Macbeth, here on the right, fainted from hunger in the wings. Despite such dire circumstances, Kurwas was committed to staging the play. He regarded this first Shakespeare production as a great historical moment for Ukrainian culture, and, in effect, a proclamation of Ukrainian cultural sovereignty. His address to the actors reveals the atmosphere of that first production. I'll first read this in Ukrainian and then my translation will follow. Прем'єра призначена на 14 серпня 2020 року. Хто розуміє десь жах такої гри слів? Шекспір, перший раз, Макбет, за 5 репетицій. Той не пожаліє тої одної двох безсонних ночей до добра великої нашої справи. Закликає до найбільшої енергії, підйому, твердості. Всі за всіх, всі за спектакль. Не ждіть, поки вам роботу дадуть в руки. Помагайте реквізиторам, костюмерам, машиністам. Робимо велике, історичне для українського театру і культури діло. Всю свою душу і енергію киньте в вогонь творчої праці над картиною. Негідний участі в історичних подвигах той, хто до мистецтва відноситься прокламацьки. Хай закипить робота в театрі так, щоб ми опритомніли вищого напруження тільки після прем'єри. Here's my translation. The premiere is slated for the 14th of August, 1920. He who understands the horror of this play of words, Shakespeare, for the first time, Macbeth, after 5 rehearsals, will not begrudge his sweat and 1 or 2 sleepless nights for the good of our cause. I call upon everyone to bestir himself to his greatest energy, briskness, steadfastness. All for one for all for the show. Don't wait until work is placed in your hands. Help the property manager, the costumers, the machinists. We are doing a great historical deed for Ukrainian theater and culture. Throw your whole soul and energy into the fire of creative work on Macbeth. He who approaches art like a shopkeeper is not worthy of participating in historical exploits. Let theatrical work come to a boil so that we may not regain consciousness in the greatest tension until after the premiere. Good must continue to work on adaptations of Macbeth, employing the play as a way of testing out his theories of theater. Back in Kiev in 1922, Kudybas founded a new company, the Berezit Artistic Association. Berezit was the archaic name of the month of March, thus signaling spring, renewal, rebirth. It was created with an ambitious agenda to produce plays, carry out theater research, experiment with stage design, performance, and audience response, publish a journal, and set up the first theater museum in Ukraine. As well as directing, Kudybas organized lectures for his actors on a variety of topics, including world history, art, music, theater, aesthetics, literature, philosophy, biology, and psychology. The actors were also obliged to undergo rigorous physical training, including fencing, acrobatics, ballet, juggling, roller skating, and trapeze walking. At its height, the Berezit had close to 400 members, including 6 studios, directorial labs, and various research committees, including a psychotechnical committee studying applied psychology in order to develop new teaching methods in the theater. In essence, this was a little university. Desiring more than just to broaden the genre, the period, and the subject matter of Ukrainian theater, Kudybas intended to rethink the whole grammar of theatrical conventions, indeed theatrical representation itself. Preparing his audience for his audacious new production of Macbeth, he argued against a revived pseudo-classical Shakespeare, as he explained in Ukrainian. Oops, sorry, too soon. Наш підхід до Шекспіра, звичайно, мусить бути підходом нашого часу. Реставрація Шекспіра в побуті його часу формально неможлива і, по суті, не потрібна. Вся цінність в сценічному втіленні класичного твору в наші дні є іменно умінню представити твір переломлення його у призмі сучасного світогляду. Our approach to Shakespeare naturally must be the approach of our day. The restoration of Shakespeare in the manners and customs of his time is formally impossible and, in essence, unnecessary. The whole value of the scenic embodiment of a classical work in our day lies namely in the ability to present a work in the refraction of the prism of the contemporary worldview. By 1924, when relative political stability followed the cessation of war and with the Soviet government's active policy of Ukrainianization, aesthetic questions came to the forefront. Was Shakespeare needed in the context of this new political entity? For Purvas, the answer was unreservedly yes. Much could be learned from the masterly constructions of his plays. It is with that purpose that he returned to the Scottish play 4 times. The most remarkable was the 1924 version, opening on the 2nd of April 1924, 2 years after the creation of the Soviet Union and a few weeks after the death of Lenin. A tragic farcical Macbeth, one unlike anything seen anywhere in the old Russian Empire, or for that matter in Western Europe. It was an examination of the ethics and the consequences of a society built on war, violence, and revolution. I've examined this production elsewhere, including in an earlier book that Professor Kuznetsky mentioned, Shakespeare and the Undiscovered World. Such a powerful political analysis, I think, could only be achieved with the use of a familiar classic. A classic whose radical revision would provide a salutary shock to its audience, forcing the audience to think. Indeed, the fallout from and the polemical debates about that production continued to reverberate throughout Kyiv for weeks, months, even years to come. Standing at the point of origin of avant-garde Ukrainian Shakespeare, Purvis's 1924 Macbeth is an iconic production that remains deeply embedded in Ukrainian theatrical history, not only because of its far-reaching, innovative investigation of theatrical practices, but also because it was rooted in the fertile ground of a cultural renaissance. But Purvis's work in the Ukrainian theater had grave consequences for its creator. Arrested in 1933, he was executed in 1937 in the personal orders of Stalin. Throughout the terrible years of the Holodomor, the Manning Famine, and the Great Terror, some Ukrainians found solace in translating and staging Shakespeare. But Shakespeare's continuing cultural significance may also be gauged by the felt need and concerted effort to supplant, suppress, or otherwise destroy Shakespeare. Such was the case with Stalin's championing of Alexander Kornichuk, who aimed to out-Shakespeare Shakespeare. The culminating moment of his play, Platon Kretchet, first published in 1935, occurs when his main character, Platon, addresses death while gazing at a skull. Contemporary commentators immediately recognized his resemblance to the Danish prince in that particular moment in Hamlet. But unlike the high-born Hamlet, this hero, a medical doctor born into the working classes, invites the spectators to contemplate humanity's glorious Soviet future, where their achievements will help them overcome death, or at the very least, help to delay it. Thus, Kornichuk transposed Shakespeare's complex tragedy into a new genre, optimistic tragedy, in which the central character represents the new myth of the immortal Soviet people. A play tacitly prohibited under Stalin, Shakespeare's Hamlet finally appeared for the first time on the Ukrainian stage in Rio in 1943, under the horrific circumstances of Nazi occupation,
I began research on this topic in 1995 when the Ukrainian archives were just beginning to open. Translated by Mikhail Lubnevsky, the play was directed by Yosef Yernyak, a gifted actor who in the early 1930s had been cast by Kurbas as the Danish prince. He never got to play that role. But like Kurbas, was arrested and exiled to the far north. Making his way finally to Ukraine, in 1943, he invited Vladimir Blavatsky, on your right, to play Hamlet. Both men regarded their production as a declaration of war against art as propaganda, and as an assertion of Ukrainian cultural identity and independence. Moreover, as Iryna himself later explained, Hamlet condensed in himself much that under the conditions of occupation at that time lay under dozens of prohibited seals and censorship. But oh, how one wanted to talk it out. Iryna's A Soviet Hamlet was produced at the Lviv Opera Theatre in the fall of the second year of the Nazi occupation. By then, Halychina, Felicia, was the battleground for a number of armies. Hamlet's plot, and most especially its thoughtful, anguished protagonist, who struggles to act ethically in a corrupt world, spoke directly to wartime circumstances. So too did the atmosphere of fear evoked by the very first scene of Shakespeare's tragedy. The play's many military references, and in particular, Hamlet's allusion to the senseless invasion of a little patch of ground in Poland. For Iryna and Blavatsky, Hamlet also allegorically represented Ukraine and its terrible destiny to be swallowed up either by the Nazis or by the Soviets. Although air raid alarms went off more and more frequently, and street roundups, violence, and executions continued to take place, the theater was nonetheless abuzz with the sound of performers and workers energetically working from morning until night, appreciating every uncertain day of their existence. Iryna and Blavatsky understood the burden they had taken up by preparing to stage the first Ukrainian Hamlet, Shakespeare's most famous play, one that had endured for hundreds of years and sparked an ocean of commentary. Preparations for the production were made with great care and much trepidation. Weekly articles published in August in Ruski Visti, the Lviv News, anonymously penned by Ostap Karnowski, built up audience expectations. Finally, the day of the premiere, the 21st of September 1943, arrived. Of this theatrical event, Ivan Minchuk wrote, "Нарешті, і ми дочекалися нашого свята." Finally, our awaited holy day has arrived, a production of Hamlet in the Ukrainian language. How many theaters in the world have staged and are staging this living tragedy of a living person? How many people admire this work of genius? How many scholars around the world have added their commentaries to it, thereby enriching the literature about Shakespeare? But hitherto, the everywhere abnormal circumstances under which our nation lived did not permit Ukrainian theaters to stage this play. So I decided not to read the Ukrainian text on this one. The celebratory, even jubilant nature of the 1943 theater event was widely expressed by audiences, critics, and actors who referred to it as Veliki Day, the Great Day, Monumentalny Day, Monumental Day, Nezabudny Day, Unforgettable Day. Blavatsky later fondly recalled the production as the crowning moment of all of the theater's activities. They had successfully passed the Shakespeare test. The auditorium of the magnificent, classically designed Lviv Opera Theatre was filled with spectators who exuded an excited anticipatory mood. Blavatsky portrayed Hamlet as an active, resolute hero, full of purpose and passionate individuality, but destroyed by the overwhelming circumstances in which he found himself. By the late fall of 1943, this appeared to be the evident and imminent tragedy of Ukraine. Notably, all Soviet theater histories completely avoided any reference to the 1943 production. You can go through all of the Russian texts that deal with Soviet theater, and whether it's in Russian or Ukrainian, and you'll find no reference to this production in film. It appeared simply not to exist. In 1956, a few years after Stalin's death, Yaroslav Helias was invited to take the part of Hamlet and was proclaimed publicly as the first Ukrainian to do so. But he was very well equipped to take up this role because he had played in the 1943 production. He took the part of the first player. Now he took on the part of the young prince who struggles to come to terms with erasures of memory, with deception, with corruption, with betrayal, with mortality. First player now had become lead actor and, in a sense, literalized some of the themes of Shakespeare's text. The relation between acting and doing, playing and playing along. In Ukraine today, during yet another barbaric war, Hamlet remains a potent, necessary, and very political play. After Ukraine gained independence in 1991, theater productions, translations, and scholarly endeavors were free from censorship and ideological circumscription. As in the 1920s, experimentation reigned throughout most of Ukraine's stages. Interest in Shakespeare was further stimulated by new translations, particularly by postmodern writer and translator William Shakespeare, who combined radical modernization with domestication, published new translations of Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and Twelfth Night. And I understand he's now working on it in the mainstream. The Revolution of Dignity, the Russian invasion of Donbass in 2014, and then further on the full-scale war that began in 2022, once again focused special attention on the role of theater and its repertoire in times of crisis. If war invites questions about essential values, connections, identity, memory, in other words, cultural, political, and emotional spaces, where does Shakespeare fit in? Astonishingly, in this current landscape of drones, air raid sirens, and missiles, there has been a Shakespeare boom in Ukraine. There's even a conference, Shakespeare boom, that took place about a month ago. Since 2014, Ukrainians have been able to see 111 new productions of Shakespeare. This is more than any other theater in the world, as far as I know, even the World Shakespeare. New productions, not reprise, not any of the new ones. Many other Shakespearean initiatives have also taken place. Zelenskyy, mentioned at the beginning of this talk as having staged Hamlet at the start of the war in 2022 in Ivano-Frankivsk, was one of the catalysts for what seemed to be an impossible wartime project. The first Ukrainian Shakespeare Festival, held in 2023 in Ivano-Frankivsk, insisting that this is a perfect time to create international platforms, that Shevchenko has emphasized Shakespeare's strong historical connections to Ukraine in wartime. Invoking, as I have, Les Clovis' 1920 Macbeth and Joseph Liebig's 1943 Hamlet, that Shevchenko considers Shakespeare as strengthening Ukrainian voices in their existential struggle to exist. The festival's website asserts that its aim was not to present mere entertainment or distraction from the war. Rather, it was to, this is a quote from their website, to be an instrument of social and political change, a tool of public diplomacy, and a platform for dialogue with the whole democratic world, as well as bringing together international productions to Ivano-Frankivsk, public lectures, discussions, and roundtable discussions. Master classes formed a part of the ambitious festival program. On the occasion of the launch of this first Ukrainian Shakespeare Festival, Martin Harris, the British High Commissioner of the United Kingdom, remarked, Ukrainian culture, as part of the world cultural heritage, once again finds itself under attack from Russia. The war against Ukraine can be seen through the prism of Hamlet's to be or not to be. With its aggression, Russia seems to say to Ukraine not to be, denying its right to be itself. Despite these brutal attempts, Ukraine responds with the resolute to be for Ukrainian language, to be theater, to be peace, to be for the Ukrainian Shakespeare Festival. The first Ukrainian Shakespeare Festival was not a unique one-off event. A second festival took place this year, in June, part of an efflorescence of many types of cultural activities throughout the country and beyond. Since the beginning of Russia's invasion, Ukrainians have traveled and performed around the world, focusing through their artistic skills, performance skills, attention on Ukraine's cultural treasures and on its current plight. Shakespeare remains a firm part of that rich Ukrainian cultural heritage. It's only been very briefly explored here. I should mention too that scholarship continues. The Ukrainian Shakespeare Center in Zaporizhia, headed by Dr. Natalia Twarkut, is involved in a variety of different activities. Among them, the publication of 2 scholarly journals, a national student competition of creative and scholarly projects. I've been on this jury for the student competition for the last 15 years, and an annual celebration of Shakespeare titled Shakespeare Days. Shakespeare Days is a month-long Shakespeare-themed series of activities and events, and it not only continued in wartime, but flourished, engaging students from across 11 regions of the country and an equal number of universities, colleges, and schools. Concerts, public lectures, panel discussions, roundtables, and workshops all continued unabated. Ukraine's special connection with the UK was emphasized when Natalia Twarkut, along with her colleague Maya Herbazuk from Lviv, were special guests at the annual commemorative parade at Stratford-upon-Avon. So in this slide, students preparing a workshop on theater in the basement of a bomb shelter. These are the circumstances in which these students are learning, and we're thriving despite all of these terrible things. So here's Natalia Twarkut right behind the Ukrainian flag, along with Michael Dobson, who's the director of the Shakespeare Institute at the University of Birmingham. And Dr. Twarkut was invited along with her late colleague, the dean of the Untitled University in Lviv, Maya Herbazuk, who sadly passed away last year. They were special guests at an annual commemorative parade at Stratford-upon-Avon, marking Shakespeare's birthday. Invited to make the formal toast to the immortal memory of William Shakespeare, Twarkut asserted that Shakespeare is, quote, our greatest shared asset and our greatest ally. She continued, by appealing to our emotions and aesthetic sensations, our critical thinking and the subconscious. Shakespeare's poetic genius is today not only transmitting eternal values, but also inspiring their defense. Today, Ukraine is fighting not only for its own future and independence, we are fighting for the free civilization which Shakespeare has helped shape. We are fighting for life and love, freedom and dignity, honor and goodness, for the right to be. I should mention in parentheses here that Michael Dobson, the director of the Institute, received a major award from the University of Gdańsk in Poland, $1,000, which he donated to the Shakespeare Center. He was so grateful. They bought a drone and they named it Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is floating above Ukraine, literally trying to defend it. Twarkut firmly believes in the power of Shakespeare and more generally culture to help Ukraine survive the war. Among the center's many projects is a collaboration with flute theater. Natalia and Maya Herbazuk big online Zoom. Saying thanks a lot for standing with Ukraine along with Shakespeare Institute. And one of their important collaborative projects is using Shakespeare as therapy to help support Ukrainian refugees with autistic children. Other projects have focused on working with mental health professionals, using theater to assist those with war-related trauma. Here are some of the phenomenal theater. Theater buildings now not only perform Shakespeare, they also serve as bomb shelters, as shelters for those who have been left homeless by the bombings, and as vibrant centers of volunteer activities. As we've seen, even in this brief overview, Shakespeare has served in many capacities in Ukraine. Leading towards my conclusion, let me consider one more term, one more metaphor. And this is entanglement. It's a term taken from quantum mechanics. Two particles are said to be entangled or correlated when changes in one influences the properties of the other, even if they are separated by vast distances. Shakespeare has been entangled with Ukraine. His works have shaped and changed and enriched Ukrainian cultural history. But Ukraine has also given Shakespeare's works a new turn. I'm going to conclude with a very small example. One of Shakespeare's greatest spine-tingling orations is the famous St. Crispin's Day speech, when England's warrior king, Henry V, galvanizes his small, greatly outnumbered troops to engage in battle with a vast French army. This rhetorically brilliant speech was the centerpiece of Laurence Olivier's 1944 film, and it was meant to inspire and in fact was dedicated to the wartime defenders of Britain. It has been rousingly performed by many other actors before and since. In the short video with which I'm ending this talk, British filmmaker, writer, and visual artist Jack Jewers shows how Ukraine and Shakespeare have become entangled. Through the juxtaposition of the measured tone of Eliza Butterworth's recitation of this speech with the powerful images from Ukraine today, we see the way in which both have become entangled, changed. We see war's terrible human cost, and we can wonder, can this speech ever be the same again?
This day is called the Feast of Christmas. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand tiptoe when this day is named and rouse him at the name of Christian. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbours and say, tomorrow is Saint Christian. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Christmas Day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Christian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world. But we in it shall we remember it? We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition, and gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they will not hear, and hold their manhood's cheek, whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day.
now and is so active with the Ukrainian Shakespeare Center, has sent a video which she asked be played today. It's in Ukrainian. Essentially, she's thanking all of us.
Шановні колеги, дорогі друзі, дозвольте мені від очолюваного мною Українського Шекспірівського центру привітати всіх присутніх на цьому урочистому заході і світове шекспірознавство з виходом у світ наукової монографії професорки Ірини Рима Макарик. Ця ґрунтовна книга, яка є результатом багаторічних дослідницьких пошуків, безперечно зацікавить не тільки літературознавців, але й фахівців з історії театру, постколоніальних студій та широких коло тих, хто хотів би зрозуміти сутність українського феномену, який полягає в тому, що нація, яка понад 300 років перебувала під тиском однієї з найжорстокіших імперій, чия територія в 28 разів більша за її власну, а населення перевищує 130 мільйонів, знаходить сили, мужність і волю виборювати своє право дати стверджувальну відповідь на славнозвісне гамлетівське питання – бути чи не бути. Ми прагнемо бути на цій землі, бути вільними людьми, бути на боці світла і докладаємо до цього всіх можливих і навіть неможливих ресурсів. Сьогодні ми, українці, воюємо з тоталітарним режимом Путіна не лише за власну незалежність, але й за майбутнє демократії та цивілізованого світу. І я хотіла б від всього серця подякувати громадянам і уряду Канади за потужну підтримку моєї країни у ці надскладні часи. Я хотіла б подякувати професорці Ірині Макаryk за любов до батьківщини її батьків, за ту віру в український народ, яку вона плекала з дитинства і юності, за глибоке розуміння специфіки нашої ментальності, історії і культури, яке, очевидно, дихало її і стало запорукою цього наукового успіху. Книга, яку випустило в світ, одне з найпрестижніших видавництв Toronto University Press, має дуже точний і вельми пронизливий назву «Shakespeare in Ukraine. Mirror, Prism, Metaphor». Вона дійсно є дзеркалом, в якому ми бачимо всі колізії складної, а під час дуже трагічної історії української шекспіряни, від Лесі Українки до Лесятурбуса і Йосипа Гірника, від шекспіровської інтертекстуальності, як спротиву тоталітаризму, до шекспіряни часів російсько-української війни. Книга дійсно є призмою, яка дає можливість побачити українську шекспіряну в світлі постколоніальних студій і зрозуміти, як наша література і театр позбавлялися тих імперських лекал, які нав'язувалися Російською імперією. І якою ціною заплатила наша нація за право зняти Шекспіра з комуністичного іконостасу. Монографія Ірини Макарик є мегафоном, яка дозволить всьому світові почути про унікальність української рецепції Шекспіра. Тим самим ця праця виконуватиме вкрай важливу функцію, навіть місію. Вона сприятиме деколонізації знань про Україну в світі. В час війни від цього залежить світова підтримка України, а отже і наша перемога. Дякую, шановній професорці Ірині Рима Макарик. Дякую від імені Шекспірівського центру, від українського шекспірознавства, від Академії наук Вищої школи України, почесним академіком якої є пані Ірина. Дякую видавництву Toronto University Press. Дякую, Канаді. Дякую всім присутнім. Слава Україні!
Thank you, Professor Makaryk, for a wonderful and clean presentation. Right now, we have some time for discussion, for questions. So, if you have a question or comment, please raise your hand.
Professor Makaryk, can you say a little bit more about the flute theater from sick children? What is a flute theater? How does it work?
Flute theater is the name of the theater. You can Google it. It's in the UK. It's run by Kelly Hunter. And she does work with autistic children, with refugees more generally. So that's the particular goal of that theater. Like this flute has various connotations. There is a character who's slightly, let us say, unintelligent and a bit of an extreme. His name is Flute. So there's God and there's Flute, and there are a few of these traits in, engages in this performance. So I think that's probably the origin from that. Yeah. I think the work that they're doing is fabulous. You can see quite a few stills if you Google them, and also the drama for those traumatized by war, either just mental trauma or physical, missing limbs and so forth, and acting out a history play, a tragedy, or even comedy sometimes works.
Dr. Makaryk, дякую за таку чудову ілюстровану презентацію. And I have a question. Considering the ongoing decolonization of Slavic studies and the centering of Russia within Slavic studies, especially since the Russia's full-scale invasion, are you seeing any similar surge of interest in Ukrainian Shakespeare from your colleagues in Shakespeare studies in English or comparative and modern literature departments, how non-Slavic departments?
Okay. So as I mentioned, the Brits, both in the UK, are very actively supporting Ukraine. Michael Dobson has been to Ukraine, I think maybe half a dozen times. He's been at the two Shakespeare festivals. My colleague, Nicoleta Chipoesh, who is Romanian by origin, but is teaching at Winchester University, is giving free lectures online to students at the Shakespeare Center in Zaporizhzhia. So they're actively working both as an organization, the British Organization of Shakespeareans, but also individually giving their time. And it's a little bit easier, their time frame is better than ours, with 7 hours difference. I'm not going to give a lecture at 3 in the morning, however much I like this topic. The European Shakespeare Research Association is another extremely active, supportive organization for the Ukrainians from the very beginning of the war and before. The acronym is ESRA, European Shakespeare Research Association. And ESRA has invited the Ukrainians to give talks and so on. It's been very active. I was at one of their conferences a number of years ago. So that hasn't changed. Where there is a block, I would say, is in the US. There has not been a huge uptake. So frankly, I was quite disappointed, even shocked, that no one from Ukraine was invited to give a plenary talk at the Shakespeare Association of America. That hasn't happened. So that's the real holdback. We don't have a Canadian Association of Shakespeareans. Around the world, there has been great interest in the Australians and so on, but it's been Europe and the UK really that have been interested. My colleagues, yes, they're interested. With the Shakespearean world, I would say that there was little interest in Ukraine. I started giving papers on this topic in the late 1980s. And the question always was, okay, but what's happening in Moscow? What's happening in Petersburg? So Ukraine was seen as an appendage of Russia. Even after sovereignty, even after 1991, there was a small interest, I would say. And as I mentioned in the acknowledgements, one of the wonderful things about the University of Toronto Press, and that Handy Clark with Ukraine is mentioning the press a few times, it's one of the few presses from the 1950s that has been publishing on Ukrainian topics. Of course, the Encyclopedia of Ukraine, among the great topics. Professor Paul Magochi's works have been published with UTP. Many works. So, you need a partner in these things. One of my colleagues in the US, Lauren Senelek, mentioned to me in the 80s that the press, he had written a book about Hamlet and Russian Hamlet. I said, some of the things that you're seeing in your book about 19th century Hamlet, you should have had a chapter on Shevchenko. And he said, actually, I did. And the editor said, that's not going to interest you. So now that people are dying, they are interested in Ukraine and know where it is. That is a horrible irony of the situation. Another factor we should consider is that Slavic studies throughout North America have been traditionally more Russian studies than studies or truly Slavic studies. So that needs to be rethought and recalibrated, let us say, by bringing forward our cultural heritage in whatever way, whether it's our internal dance, music, embroidery, peasant folk culture, or urban culture. We need to do what we can to let people know that this is a rich culture that is sovereign, that has its own cultural treasures, that is different from what is in Russia. And that's been a battle before. It's become a little bit easier now as people are truly interested. Last week I gave a very short talk on this topic at the Divinity Seminar in Ottawa, at the University of Ottawa University. And there were about, I think, maybe 60, 70 people from 30 different countries. And they were genuinely interested. So that's always heartening. Thank you.
Дуже дякую за надзвичайно цікаву і стимулюючу доповідь і презентацію. Я хочу запитатися відносно англійської мови. Чи хтось з тих письменників українських чи акторів, що писали чи перекладали Шекспіра, знали англійську мову? Якщо не знали, то з яких мов вони перекладали?
Дякую, дуже добре питання. В 19 столітті традиція була перекладати з німецького або з французького. Так само росіяни робили. Вони перекладали через німецьку мову, а німці діставали часами з французької мови переклади. Так що то були різні версії Шекспіра. Шевченко знав переклади Кетчера. Але він також міг читати по-французьки. І я маю розділ в книжці, який, власне, пише про Шевченка драматургію, що ніхто насправді не пише, не було часу про це і все говорити. Шевченко писав кілька п'єс, і він вважав, що він вживає Шекспіра естетику, чи теорію творчості. Але це не було правильне зрозуміння Шекспіра, тому що через переклади, які були дуже мелодраматичні, витворили для нього уяву про Шекспіра. Так що це складна ситуація. Є такий дивний приклад в російській літературі. де на головній обкладинці, я скажу це по-англійськи, there's a strange sort of example of the way that Shakespeare was translated and known throughout the Russian Empire. And on one of the translators, there is on the cover page, Macbeth, a translation from Shakespeare by the works of Schiller. Yeah, what does that mean? So it wasn't clear to people what was the original Shakespeare. З другої сторони, театр завжди міняється. Як ви сказали про те, що ми можемо тільки сприйняти класику в цей момент. І класика говорить до нас нашою мовою, в тому сенсі, що наш світогляд є інакший, світобачення, контекст і так далі. Так що його міняти, я думаю, є абсолютно дозволено. І перекладачі, які мусять дуже уважно застановитися над кожним словом. Перекладач дуже часто знає краще певний твір, ніж сам автор. Бо мусить добре подумати не тільки про одне слово, але слово в контексті і зрозуміти, що туди йдеться. І я думаю, що професор Тарас дивився з тим, ви працюєте над тою тематикою. В 20 столітті Купа знав англійську, вмів прочитати, він знав щось 5 чи 6 мов. І він бачив також австрійських і німецьких акторів. Переклади німців вже було зроблено, наприклад, Шлегелом і Тікеншлегел. І вважається далі як їхнім класиком. То є правдивий Шекспір в німецькій мові. Така база знання про Шекспіра, хоча вже багато інших зайнялося цим. Андрухович робить своє, сучасною мовою, усучаснює, передумує. І це все є правильно. Таке живе сотворіння. Maya Haruzak писала, що I'll say this in English because it's a good quote. Theater is a creature that is created by humans, for humans, and performed in front of humans. So it's a very unique creative activity, whereas a text, a novel, a poem, is a solitary thing you read on your own. This is something shared from the beginning. And when we share, whether it's food, culture, whatever it happens to be, but especially theater, it changes. Imagine, playing as Aldrich did King Lear in Whiteface, or playing a villain, a role that some of the critics, the Russian critics, said he's not playing, he's being himself. This wild, barbaric black man. Right? So casting plays a part. As soon as a human embodies a part, that part changes. And we saw that with that concluding wonderful video by Jack Doers, that changing a male voice to a female voice has shifted our sense of this St. Christmas Day speech from being a pro-war speech, let's go guys, to considering the other side of the war, what citizens, what civilians are enduring in this war, and how they are living it out, and what helps them survive. I know I forgot what the question was. Okay, that's it. Maybe I could say one more thing about the translations. Oleh Natyuk, translator and diplomat from Poland, has this wonderful book about Hamlet or a chapter about Hamlet in her book about Polish-Ukrainian relations. And she was able to access things I couldn't in 1995. And she discovered a lot of things about the background of people who worked on that 1943 production under Nazi occupation, including the translator, Mikhail Godninsky, who was of Jewish background. The drawings that we saw, Semen, that's not exactly right, was also Jewish, and they changed their names. in the theater helped save these people. There were quite a few Jewish background people who were working tirelessly, about 600 people in this time, creating productions. So, on the face of it, you might think 1943, so are these Ukrainians collaborating with the Nazis because they're performing also in a theater which is under Nazi occupation? But then you realize all the depths of the stories that are there and the people that managed to save themselves because they contributed to Ukrainian theater and culture. And it helped save them on a psychic level. Zelenskyy later wrote that this was the most wonderful thing to be doing in the war, translating Shakespeare.
I've been wondering for years about the relationship between Leslie Ukraine, and the Summer Night's Dream. Superficially, they seem to embody a very similar spirit. I wonder if she was influenced by Shakespeare.
She was very much influenced by Shakespeare, and there's a chapter of Leslie Ukraine in my book as well. I'd like to mention at least one piece here. And she actually has a poem called To Be or Not to Be. But for her, it's not, to be or not to be doesn't mean to be or not to be in terms of existence, but to be or not to be a poet. Because to be a poet and a writer and a dramatist as a woman is a very public profession. So there was a struggle that is happening with Ukraine. On one hand, she is very also politically minded, and she's a world traveler partly because of her TV that she's trying to deal with and going off to Egypt and various countries. And she's always interested in women's issues. And she uses Shakespeare as a kind of, I was going to say punching bag, but that's not true, as a way of trying to formulate her ideas, to use him aggressively and reframe things. So to be or not to be is, what is it to be a woman and to be a poet? She's asking those questions. And should I do this, or should I, throw it all away and then, just become a political activist? So yeah, she's very much interested in Shakespeare. From her early work all the way to the later work, she also drew up a conspectus of works that should be translated into Ukrainian to help Ukrainians open up to the world. And among the essentials is Shakespeare. And what shall I see? Дякую дуже.
Дуже дякую, професор Макарик, за надзвичайно цікаву, надзвичайно змістовну і кольорову, я би сказала, дуже візуальну і образну доповідь. І я думаю, що всі схочуть придбати сьогодні книжку, бо хочеться більше дізнатися про все те, про що вона сьогодні коротко говорила. Я хочу так само, перед тим, як ми зможемо прийти до книжки, і ще до кави, і до солодкого, хочу нагадати також про ті події, які будуть відбуватися найближчим часом в нашому науковому товаристві. Отже, 11 листопада ми будемо мати доповідь професора і не директора, а президента Києво-Могилянської академії Сергія Квіта. Він буде виступати в нас у вівторок, не в п'ятницю, тому що це єдиний день, єдиний вечір, який він міг для нас виділити. Всіх запрошуємо на цю доповідь. Це буде дуже цікава доповідь. Він буде говорити про Києво-Могилянку і про вищу освіту в Україні зараз, в період війни. Як все це там відбувається, яка реорганізація відбувається, які процеси. Так що буде дуже цікаво. А на початку грудня, 5-6 грудня, ми будемо мати велику конференцію, нашу традиційну НТСh-ську конференцію, члени НТСh науці. І 6 грудня ми будемо мати тут наочну конференцію. Ми маємо вже дуже багато заявок від різних науковців з різноманітних галузей. І програма обіцяє бути дуже цікавою. Так що я всіх запрошую до цієї події. А ще раз хочу зараз щиро з всього серця від вас усіх подякувати професор Макарик за прекрасну доповідь. Так само до нашої традиції я попрошу професор Макарик і всіх членів нашої дирекції прийти сюди до спільної замки.
Так, і можна так само до кави, до солодку ще додати.
Yeah, yeah.